The strongest people are often the easiest to overlook because they become experts at hiding their pain behind a smile. My name is Claire Bennett, and for most of my life, I believe that if I worked hard enough, smiled long enough, and stayed strong long enough, nobody would ever notice when I was falling apart. The problem with that belief is that eventually your body starts telling the truth your mouth refuses to say. The morning everything changed began like every other exhausting morning. My alarm rang at 5:30. By 6, I was already answering emails from volunteers. By 7, I was coordinating delivery schedules for a charity fundraiser that seemed to grow more complicated every hour. As the event coordinator for one of the largest nonprofit organizations in Manhattan, I spent most days solving problems before anyone else realized they existed. It was rewarding work, meaningful work, but lately it felt endless. 3 weeks earlier, I had slipped while carrying equipment during an outdoor event. Nothing serious, according to the doctor. Rest for a few days. Avoid overexertion. Simple instructions that I completely ignored. There were deadlines, commitments, responsibilities, people depending on me. Rest felt like a luxury I could not afford. So I kept working. Every day the discomfort grew worse. Every day I told myself tomorrow would be easier. Tomorrow never was. By the time Thursday arrived, simply walking across a room required more effort than I wanted to admit. Still, I smiled. Still, I said I was fine. That evening, I was supposed to meet Logan Pierce for dinner. Logan had become one of the organization's largest donors, but somewhere along the way our professional relationship had quietly evolved into friendship. At least, that was the word I used whenever anyone asked. Friendship felt safer than examining the truth too closely. Unfortunately, a last-minute crisis delayed me nearly 40 minutes. By the time I reached the restaurant, Manhattan was glowing beneath the golden lights of early evening. People filled the sidewalks. Traffic crawled through intersections. My phone displayed 3 missed messages from Logan. None of them sounded annoyed. Somehow that made me feel even worse. I hurried toward the entrance, trying my best to ignore the ache in my leg. The hostess smiled as I entered. "Mr. Pierce is waiting for you." Of course he was. Logan was never late. Ever. I spotted him immediately. Seated near the window. Dark suit. Calm expression. The kind of presence that made people instinctively pay attention without understanding why. Relief crossed his face the moment he saw me. Then concern followed so quickly that most people would have missed it. Most people were not Logan. "I am sorry I am late," I said as I reached the table. There was a problem with the event schedule, and then traffic, and the explanation stopped halfway through the sentence. Logan had not responded. He was looking down, not at my face, at the way I was standing, or more specifically, the way I was not standing normally. I suddenly became very aware of the uneven pressure on my leg, very aware of the fact that I had been favoring one side all evening. Logan slowly rose from his chair. His eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, in observation. The room around us seemed to fade into the background. The conversations, the music, the clinking glasses. None of it mattered. "Claire," he said quietly. "What happened?" I opened my mouth to give the same answer I had given everyone else for weeks. "Nothing. I am fine." But something told me Logan Pierce had already seen straight through the lie. There are people who hear your words, and there are people who notice everything you are trying not to say. Logan belonged to the second group. For a moment, I considered repeating the lie. It was familiar, comfortable, easy. I could have blamed a long day, new shoes, a minor accident, anything. But the look in his eyes made dishonesty feel impossible. "It is nothing," I said anyway. Logan's expression did not change. Somehow that made things worse. He pulled out the chair beside him instead of the one across the table. "Sit." His voice remained calm, not demanding, not negotiable. I sat. The restaurant buzzed with conversation around us. Soft music drifted through the room. Waiters moved between tables carrying plates and glasses. Yet my attention remained fixed on Logan. He crouched slightly beside my chair and looked toward my leg again. "How long?" he asked. I frowned. "How long what? How long have you been walking like that?" The question landed harder than I expected, because it was not really about my leg. It was about everything. Every ignored problem. Every delayed doctor appointment. Every exhausted morning. Every night spent convincing myself I could push through one more day. I looked away. A few weeks. Logan closed his eyes briefly. The reaction lasted less than a second, but I saw it. Concern. Real concern. "A few weeks," he repeated quietly. I immediately regretted answering honestly. It sounds worse than it is. He raised an eyebrow. Does it? Before I could respond, the server approached the table. Logan ordered dinner for both of us without even opening the menu. Normally, I would have protested. Tonight, I lacked the energy. Once we were alone again, he leaned back in his chair and studied me carefully. Tell me what happened. I sighed. I slipped during an event setup. Did you see a doctor? Yes. And I stared at the tablecloth. They told me to rest. Silence. Did you? I laughed softly. The answer was obvious. Logan shook his head. Claire. Hearing my name in that tone made me feel strangely guilty. The fundraiser needed me. The fundraiser would survive. People were counting on me. His gaze never left mine. And who was taking care of you? The question caught me completely off guard. Nobody had asked me that in years. Maybe longer. I opened my mouth, then closed it again, because I did not have an answer. Dinner arrived. Logan waited until I took the first bite before touching his own plate. The gesture should not have mattered. Somehow it did. Throughout the meal, he asked ordinary questions about work, books, and upcoming projects. Yet every few minutes his eyes drifted toward my leg, observing, measuring, worrying. By the time dessert arrived, I realized something unsettling. Logan was far more bothered by my condition than I was. As we left the restaurant later that evening, cool Manhattan air greeted us outside. The city glowed beneath thousands of lights. I took 2 steps toward the sidewalk before a sharp ache forced me to slow down. It lasted only a second. Long enough. Logan saw it immediately. He stopped walking. His jaw tightened slightly. Then he looked at me with a level of seriousness that made my stomach drop. Claire, he said quietly, I think you have been pretending everything is fine for much longer than just a few weeks. The truth usually reveals itself in small details long before anyone is brave enough to speak it aloud. After Logan's comment, the walk to my apartment became unusually quiet. The city moved around us in its usual rhythm. Taxi lights reflected across wet pavement. People hurried between restaurants and apartment buildings. Somewhere nearby, music drifted from an open doorway. Yet all I could think about was the look on Logan's face. Not judgment, not frustration, concern. The kind that made me uncomfortable because I did not know what to do with it. When we reached my building, I expected him to say goodnight. Instead, he glanced toward the stairs leading to the entrance and frowned slightly. How many floors? 3. His expression remained unchanged. Elevator. I laughed softly. No. He nodded once. Then he looked directly at me. I am walking you upstairs. Logan. Claire. The way he repeated my name immediately ended the discussion. 10 minutes later, we stood inside my apartment. The place was tidy in the way homes become when someone spends very little time enjoying them. Papers covered part of the dining table. Event schedules occupied the kitchen counter. 2 unopened packages sat near the door. Logan slowly surveyed the room. His eyes lingered on the stacks of folders. The laptop still displaying work emails. The calendar packed with notes and reminders. Finally, he looked back at me. When was your last day off? I immediately looked away. That alone answered the question. Claire. I do not know. Silence. You do not know? I shook my head. There has been a lot happening. Logan exhaled slowly. Then he walked toward the dining table and picked up one of the event binders. The pages were filled with notes, revisions, and color-coded schedules. Months of work. Months of pressure. His gaze moved across the documents before settling on a list of upcoming events. You are coordinating all of this. Most of it. By yourself. I hesitated. Mostly. For several seconds, he said nothing. The realization seemed to settle heavily between us. He was not just seeing a sore leg. He was seeing the cost behind it. The long hours. The skipped meals. The endless responsibilities. The quiet exhaustion hidden beneath every smile. Logan placed the binder back on the table. How much sleep are you getting? I laughed nervously. That sounds like a trick question. He did not smile. Claire. 5 hours. Sometimes less. The answer visibly bothered him. More than it should have. More than it bothered me. That was what made it strange. Most people admired dedication. Logan saw something else. He saw damage. He walked toward the kitchen and opened the refrigerator. Inside sat yogurt, bottled water, and very little else. His expression darkened. Please tell me this is not all you have eaten this week. I folded my arms defensively. I have been busy. He closed the refrigerator door. That is not an answer. For the first time all evening, irritation surfaced. Why does this matter so much to you? The question escaped before I could stop it. Immediately, silence filled the room. Logan looked at me for a long moment. Long enough that I almost regretted asking. Then he answered with complete honesty. Because you matter. The words landed with unexpected force. Simple, direct, impossible to misunderstand. Neither of us spoke afterward. Outside, Manhattan continued glowing beneath the night sky. Inside my apartment, I stood surrounded by evidence of a life spent taking care of everyone except myself. And for the first time, I began to realize that Logan Pierce was seeing a story I had worked very hard to hide. Some walls are built to keep pain out. Others are built to keep people away. The next morning, I woke up determined to pretend the previous evening had never happened. It was a strategy that had worked for years. Ignore the problem. Stay busy. Keep moving. Unfortunately, Logan Pierce had apparently developed plans of his own. At 8:15, my phone buzzed while I was reviewing volunteer schedules. A single message appeared on the screen. Did you eat breakfast? I stared at it, then laughed despite myself. 5 minutes later, another message arrived. Claire. That was it. Just my name. Somehow it felt more persuasive than a full paragraph. I finally replied. Coffee counts. The response came almost immediately. No. 20 minutes later, a delivery arrived at the office. Fresh fruit, oatmeal, coffee, actual breakfast. My coworkers thought it was adorable. I thought it was infuriating, mostly because it worked. Over the following days, Logan continued appearing in small, unexpected ways. Never controlling, never demanding, simply present. One afternoon he arrived at a fundraising venue carrying lunch because he suspected I would forget to eat. Another evening, he called just to make sure I had gone home instead of returning to the office. Every time I attempted to dismiss his concern, he remained completely unmoved. The more he cared, the more uncomfortable I became. Not because I disliked it, because I did not know how to accept it. Friday evening provided the perfect example. We were reviewing plans for a major charity gala scheduled 2 weeks away. Volunteers moved around the ballroom making preparations. Vendors tested lighting and sound equipment. Everyone seemed busy except Logan, who somehow noticed every detail at once, including me. I had spent nearly 6 hours on my feet. By the end of the evening, the discomfort in my leg had become difficult to ignore. Still, I kept moving, smiling, coordinating, solving problems. Then I turned too quickly and immediately regretted it. The reaction lasted only a second. Long enough. Logan appeared beside me almost instantly. Sit. I sighed. I am working. Sit. Logan. Claire. Several nearby volunteers suddenly found other places to be. I lowered my voice. I cannot stop every time something hurts. His expression softened slightly. That is exactly what worries me. The words caught me off guard. Not because of what he said, because of how he said it. There was no frustration, no criticism, only concern. Real concern. The kind I had spent years avoiding. Later that night, after everyone else left, we stood alone inside the nearly empty ballroom. City lights glowed through enormous windows overlooking Manhattan. Reflections shimmered across polished floors. The room felt strangely peaceful. Logan walked beside me as I gathered my things. Finally he spoke. Why is accepting help so difficult for you? I immediately looked away. It is not. He raised an eyebrow. Claire. I smiled weakly. Maybe a little. Logan waited. Patient as always. The silence stretched longer than I intended. Then I heard myself say something I rarely admitted aloud. Because if I let people help, eventually they leave. The confession surprised both of us. For several seconds, neither of us moved. Logan studied me carefully, not trying to fix the statement, not rushing to disagree, simply understanding its weight. Finally he spoke. Quietly, gently. Then whoever taught you that was wrong. The ballroom fell silent again. Outside, the city continued shining beneath the evening sky. Inside, one of the walls I had spent years building developed its first real crack. And for the first time, I was not entirely sure I wanted to repair it. The promises we make when we are hurting often become the rules that quietly shape the rest of our lives. After the conversation in the ballroom, I spent the entire weekend thinking about Logan's words. Whoever taught you that was wrong. Simple, direct, difficult to forget. The problem was that he did not know the full story. Nobody did. Monday morning arrived with gray skies and cold rain sweeping across Manhattan. I was sitting alone in my office reviewing event budgets when my gaze drifted toward an old photograph resting on the corner of my desk. It showed a younger version of me standing beside my mother outside a small apartment building. We were smiling. At least the camera believed we were smiling. The truth was more complicated. My father had left when I was 16. Not dramatically, not cruelly. He simply walked away from responsibilities he no longer wanted. Bills accumulated. Promises disappeared. My mother worked multiple jobs to keep us afloat. I watched her exhaust herself trying to carry burdens that should never have belonged to one person. Somewhere during those years, I made a decision. I would never depend on anyone. If people could leave, then relying on them felt dangerous. Independence became survival. Survival became habit. Habit became identity. By noon, I had successfully convinced myself not to think about any of it anymore. Then Logan arrived. Of course he did. He appeared carrying coffee and the expression of a man who had already decided something before entering the room. You look tired. I accepted the coffee. Good afternoon to you too. One corner of his mouth lifted slightly. That is not a denial. We spent the next hour discussing the upcoming charity gala. Volunteers. Sponsorships. Seating arrangements. Ordinary topics. Comfortable topics. Then Logan noticed the photograph on my desk. His gaze lingered for a moment. Is that your mother? I nodded. Yes. You look alike. Something in his voice encouraged honesty. Maybe it was the patience. Maybe it was the fact that he never pushed when people were not ready. Whatever the reason, I found myself sharing details I usually kept hidden. I told him about the small apartment, the financial struggles, the long nights watching my mother work herself beyond exhaustion. Logan listened quietly. The more I spoke, the more pieces seemed to fall into place. Finally, he asked a question that struck directly at the center of everything. Is that when you decided you had to do everything alone? The room fell silent. I stared out the office window toward the rain-covered city. Maybe. Logan remained patient. Waiting. Not judging. Waiting. Eventually, I laughed softly. Actually, yes. Saying it aloud felt strange. Like admitting a secret I had carried for years. I promised myself I would never put my future in someone else's hands. Logan nodded slowly. He understood more than I expected. And that promise helped you survive. I looked at him in surprise. Most people would have criticized the decision. Logan simply understood it. Then he added, but surviving and living are not the same thing. The words settled heavily between us. Because deep down, I knew he was right. For years I had been surviving, solving problems, meeting deadlines, carrying responsibilities. Yet somewhere along the way, I had forgotten how to let people stand beside me. Rain continued falling beyond the windows. Traffic moved through the city below. Logan sat across from me holding a cup of coffee while quietly dismantling beliefs I had carried since childhood. And for the first time, I began wondering whether strength had never meant doing everything alone. Maybe true strength meant trusting the right person enough to stay. Some people prove they care through promises. Others prove it by showing up again and again until you finally believe they are not leaving. The weeks after my conversation with Logan passed differently than the months before it. Not dramatically. Not all at once. But small things began changing. The first change was that Logan stopped asking whether I needed help. He simply helped. If a volunteer canceled at the last minute, somehow a replacement appeared. If an event venue required additional support, resources arrived before anyone had to ask. He never took credit, never made a speech about it. Most of the time, I only discovered his involvement afterward. One Thursday afternoon, I arrived at a community center to prepare for a fundraising event. The setup crew was already working. Tables were arranged. Decorations were finished. Registration stations were ready. Everything looked perfect. One of the volunteers smiled when she saw me. Your friend was here early this morning. I immediately knew who she meant. Logan. She nodded. He helped move equipment and stayed until everything was finished. I looked around the room. The work would have taken hours. My chest tightened unexpectedly. Nobody had asked him to do that. He simply did it because he knew it would make my day easier. That evening, I found him sitting alone in a quiet restaurant overlooking the river. City lights reflected across the water beyond the windows. He looked up as I approached. How was the event? I sat down across from him. You already know. One corner of his mouth lifted. Maybe. I shook my head. You did not have to spend your morning moving tables. Apparently I did. Why? Logan glanced toward the river. For a moment, I thought he might avoid the question. Instead, he answered honestly, "Because I knew you would try to do it yourself." I laughed softly. The annoying part was that he was right. Dinner passed comfortably. The conversation moved from work to books to travel plans neither of us had time to take. Somewhere between the appetizers and dessert, I realized something surprising. Being around Logan felt easy. Easier than almost any relationship in my life. There was no performance. No pressure. No expectation that I had to carry everything perfectly. Later, after we left the restaurant, we walked along the waterfront beneath a sky filled with stars and city lights. The cool air carried the scent of the river. Boats moved quietly across dark water. Logan matched his pace to mine without thinking about it, without drawing attention to it, without making me feel weak. That simple consideration somehow meant more than grand gestures ever could. We stopped near the railing overlooking the harbor. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Then I did something that would have seemed impossible a few months earlier. "Can you help me with something next week?" The words felt unfamiliar, strange, vulnerable. Logan turned toward me. Surprise appeared briefly in his eyes before disappearing beneath something warmer. "Of course. No questions. No conditions. No lecture about finally asking for help. Just a simple answer. Of course." The ease of it nearly made me emotional. We continued walking beneath the glow of the city. For years I had believed independence meant never needing anyone. Logan was teaching me something different. Dependence and trust were not the same thing. Trust was a choice, a gift, and little by little, without pressure or demands, he was becoming the first person I truly trusted to stay. Trust does not arrive all at once. It arrives in small moments that seem insignificant until one day you realize they have changed everything. The following week became one of the busiest periods of the year for our organization. The charity gala was finally approaching, and every department seemed to need something at the exact same time. Normally, I would have handled every problem personally. Normally, I would have stayed late every night and carried the entire weight myself. This time was different. Not because the work had become easier, because I had finally stopped pretending I had to do it alone. On Tuesday morning, I handed part of the volunteer coordination to another team member. On Wednesday, I allowed someone else to manage vendor communication. By Thursday, I had delegated enough responsibilities to leave the office before sunset for the first time in months. The strange thing was that nothing collapsed. No disaster appeared. No emergency arrived to punish me for letting go. The world continued turning exactly as before. When I mentioned this to Logan during dinner that evening, he looked far too pleased with himself. "You seem surprised." I laughed. "Maybe I am." And I stirred my tea thoughtfully. "And maybe you were right." His smile appeared slowly. "I am going to enjoy hearing that." I rolled my eyes. "Do not get used to it." The restaurant overlooked Central Park. Outside, autumn leaves drifted across sidewalks beneath golden streetlights. The city felt softer than usual, calmer. Maybe it was the season. Maybe it was the company. After dinner, we walked through the park together. Families strolled beneath the trees. Musicians played near a fountain. The air carried the scent of coffee and fallen leaves. Everything felt peaceful. For a while, we talked about ordinary things. Books, travel, childhood memories. Then the conversation shifted unexpectedly. "What did you want to be when you were 10?" I asked. Logan looked genuinely surprised. "Nobody has ever asked me that. That is not an answer." He laughed quietly. The sound was rare enough that it immediately captured my attention. "An architect." "Really? Really? What happened?" His gaze moved toward the skyline beyond the trees. Life happened. There was no bitterness in the statement, just acceptance. I studied him differently after that. Most people saw power when they looked at Logan Pierce. They saw confidence, influence, success. Very few people stopped to wonder what dreams existed before all of that. For the first time, I realized he carried his own collection of sacrifices and disappointments, his own hidden scars. Somehow that realization brought us closer. Not because we shared identical experiences, because we both understood what it meant to spend years carrying responsibilities nobody else could see. As we approached the park entrance, my phone buzzed with a message from one of the event managers. A minor issue, nothing serious. Instinct immediately told me to solve it myself. Instead, I paused, then forwarded the message to the appropriate team member. "Done." Logan noticed. "You did not answer it." "No." "How does that feel?" I smiled. "Strange." He nodded, and I looked up at the city lights shining above us. For the first time in a long time, my shoulders felt lighter. My thoughts felt quieter. My heart felt less alone. Good, I admitted. Logan's expression softened. We continued walking side by side beneath the glow of Manhattan. And somewhere between the falling leaves and the evening lights, I realized trust was no longer something I feared. It was becoming something I chose. Sometimes the moment that changes your life is not loud. It is not dramatic. It does not arrive with fireworks or grand speeches. Sometimes it arrives in the form of a simple truth you have been avoiding for years. 2 weeks later, the charity gala finally arrived. Months of planning had led to this single evening. The ballroom glowed beneath crystal chandeliers. Hundreds of guests filled the room. Conversations blended with music and laughter. Volunteers moved efficiently between tables. Everything worked exactly as it was supposed to. For the first time in my career, I was not managing every detail personally. My team handled problems before they reached me. Responsibilities were shared. Trust was shared. The event was succeeding because I had finally allowed other people to help. The realization felt strangely emotional. Standing near the back of the ballroom, I watched guests enjoying an evening that had once seemed impossible to organize. Pride warmed my chest. Not because everything was perfect, because I no longer believed perfection was my responsibility alone. Across the room, Logan caught my eye. He stood speaking with several donors. Confident, calm, yet somehow he always seemed aware of where I was. The moment our eyes met, he smiled slightly. The gesture lasted only a second. Somehow it felt more meaningful than entire conversations. Hours later, after the final speech concluded and the last guests began leaving, exhaustion finally settled into my bones. Not the dangerous exhaustion I had carried months earlier. A healthier kind. The kind that follows meaningful work. I stepped outside onto a quiet balcony overlooking Manhattan. Cold evening air greeted me. Below, the city shimmered beneath thousands of lights. Traffic moved through the streets like rivers of gold. The skyline stretched endlessly into the distance. For several moments, I simply stood there enjoying the silence. Then I heard familiar footsteps behind me. Logan. He joined me beside the railing without speaking. We watched the city together. Comfortable silence had become one of my favorite things about him. Eventually he broke it. You did well tonight. I smiled softly. We did well. Logan glanced at me. That answer would have been impossible 6 months ago. I laughed because he was right. 6 months ago, I would have accepted all responsibility for every success and every failure. 6 months ago, I believed carrying everything alone made me strong. The woman standing on that balcony felt different. Stronger somehow. Not because she carried more. Because she finally knew she did not have to. The thought lingered quietly between us. Then, before I could stop myself, the truth emerged. I am tired, Logan. The words sounded simple. Yet they carried years of weight. Years of pressure. Years of pretending. He turned toward me fully. Waiting. Listening. I took a slow breath. I think I have been tired for a very long time. My voice remained steady. Barely. Tired of proving I can handle everything. Tired of pretending I do not need anyone. Tired of being strong every minute of every day. The city lights blurred slightly as emotion tightened my throat. For once, I did not hide it. For once, I allowed someone to see it. Logan said nothing immediately. He simply remained there beside me. Steady. Present. The way he always had been. Finally he spoke. Quietly. Gently. Then stopped carrying it alone. The words settled into the cold evening air. Simple words. Life-changing words. Standing beside him above the glowing city, I realized something important. The strongest thing I had ever done was not surviving by myself. The strongest thing I had ever done was finally allowing someone to stay. Healing rarely announces itself. One day you simply wake up and realize the weight you carried for years no longer feels quite so heavy. 6 months after the charity gala, spring arrived in Manhattan. The city seemed brighter somehow. Trees bloomed along sidewalks. Outdoor cafes filled with conversation. People lingered in parks instead of rushing through them. Life moved with a little more warmth. A little more hope. My own life felt different too. The injury that had once forced me to limp through every day had fully healed. More importantly, so had many of the habits that came with it. I no longer worked until exhaustion. I no longer believed every problem belonged to me. The organization was thriving because our team worked together, not because one person sacrificed everything. It turned out the world functioned perfectly well when responsibility was shared. Who knew? One Saturday afternoon, I stood inside a community literacy center that our organization had recently helped open. Children filled the reading rooms. Volunteers organized books. Families gathered for weekend programs. The place buzzed with life. Watching it all unfold filled me with quiet pride. Months earlier, I would have focused only on unfinished tasks. Today, I allowed myself to enjoy the moment. Through the front windows, I noticed a familiar figure crossing the street. Logan. He entered carrying 2 coffees and the same calm confidence that seemed to follow him everywhere. Several volunteers greeted him immediately. Most of them adored him. The rest had simply not met him yet. He handed me one of the coffees. "You look happy." I smiled. "I think I am." The answer surprised both of us. Not because it was untrue, because it was true. Completely true. Later that evening, after the center closed, we walked along the Hudson River as the sun began setting across the water. Golden light reflected against the skyline. Boats drifted quietly in the distance. The city felt peaceful. We eventually reached a small bench overlooking the river. Neither of us spoke for several minutes. The silence felt comfortable. Familiar. Home. Finally, Logan looked toward me. "Do you remember the first dinner?" I laughed softly. "The one where I arrived late?" "Very late." I apologized at least 3 times. 4. I shook my head, smiling. Then his expression softened. "You were trying so hard to convince everyone you were fine." The memory felt strangely distant now, yet I could still see that version of myself. Exhausted, overwhelmed, walking through pain because stopping felt impossible. Logan had seen the truth before I did. He noticed the limp when everyone else noticed the apology. He saw the burden hidden behind the smile. Most importantly, he stayed. Through every difficult conversation, every setback, every moment I tried to retreat behind old habits. He stayed. I looked out across the river as evening settled around us. "Thank you." Logan frowned slightly. "For what?" I laughed. "For being patient enough to wait for me to figure things out." For a moment he said nothing. Then he reached for my hand. The gesture felt natural now. Easy, like something that had always belonged there. "You did the hard part yourself, Claire." "Maybe. But I knew the truth. Some journeys become possible because someone walks beside you." The city lights slowly appeared across Manhattan as the sun disappeared beyond the horizon. The future stretched ahead of us, unwritten and uncertain. Yet for the first time in my life, uncertainty did not feel frightening. Because strength was no longer about standing alone, and happiness was no longer something I postponed until every problem disappeared. It was here, beside me, holding my hand as the river reflected the lights of the city. And in that quiet moment, I finally understood that the best chapters of my life had begun the day someone noticed I was hurting and cared enough to ask why.